There comes a moment in every human being's life when the truth stops whispering and starts roaring. A moment when the world shifts, not because something finally changed, but because you finally saw it for what it always was. For so long, someone may have looked at you and mistaken your kindness for weakness, your patience for confusion, your silence for naivety. But the truth, you were never naive. You were observing. You were gathering wisdom. You were learning the blueprint of someone who wasn't ready for the depth of what you carry. Some people run from intimacy not because they don't want love, but because they don't know how to stand in front of someone who can truly see them. So they avoid. They deflect. They push away. And while they were busy avoiding, you were busy awakening. You watched their patterns, not to judge them, but to understand them. You listened to their words, not to cling to them, but to discern their truth from their wounds. You stayed present, not because you didn't know how to walk away, but because you wanted to be sure of your own heart before you made your move. And then one day, something happened. They realized you weren't the naive one. You were the one with clarity, the one with emotional depth, the one with courage, the one who could love without running, see without flinching, and stand without collapsing. You became the reflection they weren't ready to face. Listen, there's a divine principle at play in your life. Nothing that is rooted in truth is ever lost by accident. Your awareness, your intuition, your spirit, they have been guiding you this entire time. You weren't being fooled. You were being trained to recognize alignment, trained to trust your discernment, trained to understand the difference between someone who can meet you and someone who can only drain you. And now you carry a deeper knowing, a sharper vision, a stronger sense of self. You don't need to chase closure. You don't need to prove your worth. You don't need to convince anyone to see your value, because the moment they realized you were never naive was the moment you finally realized you were always powerful. So stand tall, stand open, stand grounded in your truth. Your observation has turned into wisdom. Your silence has turned into strength. Your experience has turned into purpose. And from this point on, you walk not as someone who was underestimated, but as someone who finally recognizes the magnitude of their own presence. Now take that awareness, take that divine clarity, and step boldly into the life you were always meant to live. Your perceived naivety was actually emotional intelligence in silence, an inner knowing that didn't need to scream to be understood. There's a profound, often underestimated power in a person who chooses not to react immediately, who decides to watch the unfolding of a situation rather than rush to define it. Many people mistake that quiet, patient presence for gullibility, as if stillness equals ignorance. But stillness is not passivity. Stillness is clarity. Stillness is discernment. Stillness is wisdom refining itself. When you held space and allowed someone to show you who they were through their actions, you weren't doing it because you were oblivious. You were doing it because you understood that truth reveals itself in behavior far more authentically than it does in excuses, promises, or temporary performances. You weren't blind. You were giving their truth enough room to speak. Your silence was not the silence of someone who had no voice. It was the silence of someone who didn't need to justify themselves. You were attuned to the subtle cues, the inconsistencies, the energy shifts that most people overlook. Emotional intelligence often doesn't announce itself. It's the quiet awareness that notices the things that others pretend aren't happening. It's the ability to sense someone's fear behind their avoidance, their insecurity behind their distance, their self-protection behind the walls they build. People who run from intimacy often cannot comprehend this level of emotional acuity. They expect reactions, outbursts, confrontation, or the typical cycle of confusion and clinging that they've grown accustomed to creating. When instead they're met with calm observation, they misinterpret it. They assume you didn't see the red flags. They assume you didn't recognize the inconsistency. They assume you didn't feel the withdrawal. But you did. You just didn't let it control you. You were gathering information, not to weaponize it, but to understand the landscape of the connection. You wanted to see the truth without the fog of emotion distorting it. You wanted to understand the rhythm of the dynamic, what triggered their avoidance, what fueled their distance, what softened their defenses. You weren't naive, you were intentional. You were studying the environment, studying the behavior, studying the emotional patterns, so that when you moved from alignment, not impulse. And there's something extraordinary about the person who chooses observation over reaction. They develop the ability to see the whole picture while others are still tangled in their own defenses. Your emotional intelligence allowed you to recognize that the avoidance behavior wasn't a reflection of your worth, but a reflection of their struggle. You saw their fear of intimacy. You sensed their nervousness and vulnerability. You noticed the way they pulled back when things felt too real. You understood the contradiction between their desire for connection and their terror of it. And while they thought you were lost or confused, you were actually becoming more grounded. You understood more than you ever let on. You were aware of their wounds, even if they never spoke them. You were aware of their patterns, even if they never acknowledged them. You were aware of the emotional distance they tried to create, even if they believed they hid it well. Your observation was not passivity, it was mastery. It was the quiet strength of someone who does not need to chase or control the narrative. It was the calm presence of someone who trusts their intuition more than the illusion in front of them. Your emotional intelligence allowed you to see through the cracks, through the excuses, through the patterns, through the stories. Someone tells themselves to avoid confronting their own heart. What they read as naivety was actually your ability to witness truth without reacting to it prematurely. It was your ability to remain steady while someone else wrestled with their own chaos. It was your ability to see their potential without ignoring their reality. It was the power of emotional awareness, subtle, steady, and far wiser than they ever expected. Observation gave you clarity about patterns, behaviors, and the truth beneath the surface. And that clarity didn't arrive in one sudden moment. It built itself slowly, layer by layer, through every interaction, every silence, every contradiction that didn't quite align with the words being spoken. When you chose to observe, you shifted into a position of power without even trying. You weren't chasing answers, you were allowing truth to reveal itself in real time. And truth always surfaces when you're patient enough to watch. In every relationship, romantic, platonic, or otherwise, people reveal themselves not through grand gestures, but through the small, unnoticed habits that eventually form a pattern. While others get swept up in the intensity of emotions, you maintained enough distance within yourself to actually see what was happening. You weren't ignoring red flags, you were studying them. You weren't trying to fix someone, you were trying to understand the emotional architecture behind their actions. Patterns became your compass. You noticed how consistency, or the lack of it, told the real story. You saw how the avoidant would pull close just long enough to feel safe, then retreat the moment vulnerability demanded presence. You watched how the excuses repeated themselves in slightly different forms, circling the same core wound they never addressed. You saw how their communication tightened when emotions deepened, how their walls came up at the exact moments connection asked for depth. This wasn't about judgment. You weren't looking for flaws, you were looking for truth. Observation allowed you to separate what they said from what they showed. It gave you the insight to recognize intention versus capacity. Some people want closeness, but don't have the emotional tools to maintain it. Some people crave connection, yet sabotage it the moment it becomes real. Because you observe carefully, you learn to distinguish between desire and readiness, between hope and reality, between potential and pattern. The clarity you gained wasn't only about them, it was about you. By watching how they moved, you learned about your own boundaries, your own expectations, and your own emotional thresholds. You saw where you were overgiving. You saw where you were shrinking to make space for someone who wasn't expanding with you. You recognized where you were interpreting their silence as something personal, when in truth, it was rooted in their own unresolved fear. You began to understand your own emotional landscape more deeply, not because they guided you, but because observing them illuminated your own needs and values. You learned what kind of communication nourished you, what level of emotional intimacy you required, and where you would no longer tolerate ambiguity or inconsistency. Observation gave you the clarity to see the connection from a wider lens, not just the moments that felt good or hopeful. You saw the entire arc, the emotional temperature, the rhythm of the interaction. Instead of swimming in the current, you stepped back and watched its flow, its direction, its depth. And once you saw the pattern, you couldn't unsee it. Clarity is powerful because it removes the illusions we cling to. It dissolves fantasy and reveals the truth of a person's emotional availability. It allows you to see the wounds beneath their behavior, the story beneath their silence, the fear inside their distance. When you truly observe someone, you stop taking their actions personally and start understanding them through the lens of their own history, their conditioning, their pain. This kind of clarity is liberating. It frees you from confusion. It protects you from emotional entanglement with someone who doesn't know how to hold the connection you offered. And perhaps most importantly, it helps you reclaim your sense of self. Because once you see the truth, you can no longer be trapped by what you hoped someone would become. Your observation wasn't passive, it was transformational. It allowed you to step out of the fog and into truth. And once you had that truth, you had the power to make decisions not based on longing, but based on alignment. Not based on fear, but on self-awareness. Not based on their avoidance, but on your clarity. Avoidant behavior often masks fear, insecurity, and unhealed wounds, and the more you observed, the more clearly you began to see that their distance had nothing to do with your worth. Avoidance is rarely about the person being avoided. It's about the inner battles the avoidant has never learned to face. When someone pulls away, shuts down, or withdraws emotionally, it's not because connection is unwanted. It's because connection feels dangerous. To someone carrying unhealed wounds, closeness is not a safe space. It's a vulnerability that threatens to expose everything they've spent years trying to bury. Rather than leaning into intimacy, avoidants retreat. They create space not because they don't care, but because caring activates fears they've never learned to soothe. They shrink back the moment emotions deepen because deeper emotions demand authenticity, presence, and openness, qualities they long for but are terrified to embody. Their avoidance is a shield, a third skin built from old experiences, broken trust, abandonment trauma, or childhood. Environments where emotional expression was dismissed, mocked, or punished. For an avoidant, being truly seen feels like standing unprotected in the middle of a storm. It feels overwhelming, destabilizing, and unfamiliar. So they choose what feels safer, control through distance, predictability through withdrawal, emotional regulation through shutting down. To the outside world, it looks cold or careless, but beneath the surface lies a heart that doesn't know how to stay open without fear. You began to notice these patterns, not through their words, but through their emotional reflexes. When things were light, easy, and undemanding, they could show up. They could laugh, talk, connect, maybe even appear fully present. But the moment vulnerability touched the space between you, they recoiled. They didn't recoil from you, they recoiled from the version of themselves they were afraid to reveal. Avoidants often carry a belief, consciously or unconsciously, that if someone gets too close, they will either lose themselves or be hurt. So to avoid the pain of potential loss, they preemptively create distance. The irony is that they crave closeness deeply, but closeness feels like the very thing that could break them. Their insecurity is not always loud. It may never be spoken. Sometimes it shows up as inconsistency. Sometimes it shows up as emotional numbness. Sometimes as mixed signals, defensiveness, or unexplained withdrawal. What you saw was not someone who couldn't care. It was someone who didn't know how to care safely. And this is where your clarity became power. You began to see that their avoidance wasn't a rejection of you, it was protection of themselves. You recognized that their behavior reflected their capacity, not your value. You understood that their wounds had created a survival strategy, one that built walls instead of bridges. You may have even sensed the sadden beneath their retreat, the longing inside their resistance. Because avoidance doesn't mean absence of emotion. In fact, avoidants often feel deeply, but they've learned to suppress rather than express. Their fear is that if they open the door even a little, the flood will overwhelm them. Your insight allowed you to stop personalizing their behavior. You realized that it wasn't your job to fix their wounds or chase their presence. Their journey is their own, and no amount of love, patience, or understanding can force someone to step into their healing before they are ready. Seeing the insecurity beneath their avoidance gave you compassion, but it also gave you boundaries. You understood their struggle, but you also recognized the importance of honoring your own emotional needs. Their wounds were real, their fear was real, but so was your desire for healthy reciprocal connection. And with that clarity, you learned to stop interpreting their distance as a reflection of your worth and begin seeing it for what it truly was, a reflection of their unhealed pain. Your presence, consistency, and authenticity exposed what the avoidant tried to hide, not through confrontation or force, but through the sheer power of being someone who shows up with an open heart. When a person who fears intimacy encounters someone who embodies emotional availability, it creates an uncomfortable contrast, a mirror they cannot easily escape. Avoidants spend much of their lives controlling how deeply others get to see them. They manage interactions carefully, revealing just enough to maintain connection, but not enough to feel vulnerable. Yet your steady presence disrupted that rhythm, not because you pushed, but because you didn't play the game they were accustomed to. You didn't chase them with intensity, nor did you retreat into emotional games. You showed up honestly. You were consistent in why. Our communication, clear in your intentions and sincere in your energy. While some people mask their feelings or manipulate dynamics to protect themselves, you chose the path of openness. And openness is powerful. It creates a resonance that reveals what is real and exposes what is avoided. The avoidant wasn't used to someone who could sit in emotional truth without flinching. They weren't used to someone who didn't collapse under silence or react with insecurity at the first sign of distance. Your steadiness made their unpredictability more obvious, not only to you but to themselves. Your emotional maturity brought their emotional avoidance to the surface. You didn't need to call out their patterns. Your presence made the patterns undeniable. Authenticity shines a light on everything false, not intentionally but inherently. When you spoke your truth without demanding theirs, it created an internal tension they couldn't easily ignore. Avoidants often rely on ambiguity to maintain control. Unclear feelings, mixed signals, emotional push and pull, but your consistency disrupted that. You didn't allow the fog to distort your perception. You didn't confuse their hesitation for your inadequacy. And that clarity forced them to become aware of their own inconsistency. Your energy highlighted the difference between connection built on fear and connection built on truth. You weren't performing or pretending. You weren't hiding behind defenses. You weren't afraid of emotional intimacy. And in contrast, their guardedness became impossible for them to rationalize. When you show up with genuine presence, those who hide behind emotional walls suddenly feel exposed, not because you're tearing down their barriers, but because your authenticity magnifies the cracks in those barriers. Your presence reminded them of something they had long avoided. The vulnerability required for real connection. The safety required for emotional intimacy, the courage required to be seen. And while it might not have transformed them instantly, it awakened a discomfort, a recognition that their strategies no longer protected them in the ways they once believed. Your consistency was especially destabilizing for them. Avoidants often expect inconsistency from others because inconsistency has been their emotional reality for so long. They anticipate abandonment, betrayal, miscommunication, or emotional volatility. But instead of confirming their fears, you disconfirmed them. You remained steady. You remained patient. You remained yourself, even when their actions tried to pull you into their fear-driven patterns. That steadiness forced them to confront their inner contradictions. How do you distance yourself from someone who isn't threatening your peace? How do you run from someone who isn't chasing? How do you hide from someone who isn't trying to expose you, only understand you? Your authenticity made them aware of the mask they had been wearing. It wasn't that you intentionally tried to unmask them. It's that authenticity naturally reveals inauthenticity. Truth naturally reveals avoidance. Presence naturally reveals absence. And whether they admitted it or not, your energy showed them something about themselves they had long kept hidden, that they desired connection but were terrified of it, that they wanted depth but resisted the vulnerability required for it, that they felt safer in distance even as they longed for closeness. You didn't expose them through judgment. You exposed them through alignment, through truth, through the quiet power of being someone who refuses to dilute who they are. Your presence illuminated everything they tried to hide, not through force, but through the undeniable clarity of a heart that stands open, even in the face of someone who can't yet. Do the same. Your growth became undeniable once you stopped internalizing their distance, because that was the moment you shifted from reacting to rising. As long as you believed their withdrawal was somehow your fault, you stayed tethered to a distorted perspective, one that left you doubting your own intuition, your own value, your own emotional depth. But the moment you realized that their avoidance belonged to them, not to you, something powerful awakened inside you. You began to reclaim the emotional territory you had once surrendered. You stopped shrinking to make their fear comfortable. You stopped bending to accommodate their emotional absence. You stood up straighter within your spirit, And that internal shift changed everything. Growth isn't always loud. Sometimes it begins quietly, in the subtle moments when you catch yourself recognizing patterns rather than getting lost in them. When you start observing your emotional responses instead of being overwhelmed by them. When you feel the urge to take their behavior personally but choose to breathe, reflect, and reframe. That is the beginning of power. The moment you recognize that your feelings are valid, your needs are real, and your self-worth is not up for negotiation. When you stopped internalizing their avoidance, your self-perception expanded. You began to see yourself not through the lens of someone who couldn't meet you emotionally, but through the lens of someone who deeply deserved connection, truth, reciprocity, and presence. You started to understand that their inability to show up consistently didn't mean you were too much. It meant they were unprepared. Their silence didn't mean you weren't worth communicating with. It meant communication triggered the very vulnerability they couldn't face. Their inconsistency wasn't a signal for you to try harder. It was a mirror reflecting their lack of redesign. This clarity created a profound shift in your emotional posture. Instead of leaning in anxiously, you leaned back into your own strength. Instead of trying to decode their distance, you decoded your own needs. You learned to recognize the difference between emotional alignment and emotional alchemy. With one you're met, with the other you're drained. And when you made that distinction, your boundaries naturally strengthened, not as walls, but as standards. Your growth became visible in your choices. You stopped settling for half-hearted communication, for breadcrumbs of affection, for the illusion of connection that never translated into action. You began to require consistency as a baseline rather than a bonus. You became more anchored in your truth. You became more courageous in expressing what you needed. You became more willing to walk away from dynamics that distorted your self-worth. And this growth wasn't just internal. It radiated outward. You showed up differently. You spoke differently. You carried yourself with a confidence that didn't need validation. You engaged with life in a way that reflected self-respect rather than emotional scarcity. People around you started to notice. Even the avoidant noticed, because your energy no longer fed into their fear-driven patterns. You broke the cycle by not participating in it. Avoidants often operate on the assumption that the other person will mold themselves around their emotional limitations. But you didn't. Not anymore. And that shift was unmistakable. Your growth challenged the dynamic. It confronted their comfort zone. It forced them to see that you were no longer someone who could be kept in emotional limbo. You had evolved beyond confusion, beyond hoping they would change, beyond craving validation from someone incapable of giving it consistently. Growth has a way of illuminating truth. It reveals who is capable of rising with you and who is only comfortable when you stay small. When you grew, you created a gap. Not because you abandoned them, but because you elevated yourself. You outgrew the version of you that waited for clarity from someone who avoided providing it. You stepped into a higher understanding of your worth, and in doing so you exposed the stagnation in the dynamic. Once you stopped internalizing their distance, you reclaimed every part of yourself that you once handed over in silence. You started choosing emotional alignment over emotional confusion. You stopped chasing answers and started becoming them. And when your growth reached that level of clarity, it became undeniable, not just to you but to everyone around you, including the person who once assumed you would never rise. Awareness empowered you to reclaim your value and rewrite the narrative, because awareness is the point where everything changes. Before awareness, you move through connections, reacting rather than choosing, absorbing energy rather than discerning it, interpreting behavior through the lens of your own fears instead of the truth of the situation. But once awareness arrives, it disrupts old patterns like a spiritual earthquake. It pulls you out of emotional autopilot and places you firmly back into the seat of your own power. You stop living as a character in someone else's story and begin authoring your own. Awareness is not just insight. It is liberation. It frees you from believing that someone else's emotional limitations define your worth. It frees you from carrying responsibility for wounds that do not belong to you. It frees you from thinking you must earn love through effort, proving, or overextending. Before awareness, you believed their distance meant something was wrong with you. After awareness, you saw clearly that their avoidance reflected the fears, patterns, and unhealed led places within them, not within you. This shift changes not only how you see the dynamic, it changes how you see yourself. You stop viewing yourself as someone waiting to be chosen and begin seeing yourself as someone who chooses consciously and intentionally. You stop trying to interpret mixed signals and begin interpreting your own emotional needs. You stop hoping for clarity from them and start generating clarity from within. That is the moment the narrative breaks open and the moment your personal power returns. Once awareness expanded inside you, the emotional spell was broken. You could finally see the subtle ways you had been internalizing behavior that was never yours to carry. The moments you shrank your truth so they wouldn't feel overwhelmed. The ways you softened your expectations so they wouldn't pull away. The times you held space for emotions they never reciprocated. With awareness, you began to step back and ask, why am I accepting this? What do I truly deserve? What do I need in order to feel emotionally safe, seen, and valued? These questions didn't emerge from hurt. They emerged from awakening. And awakening always brings you back to yourself. You realized you were worthy of consistent love, worthy of emotional presence, worthy of a connection that didn't require sacrificing your self-respect. Once you understood this, the avoidance no longer felt personal. It felt like information. It felt like clarity. It felt like a guide showing you exactly where imbalance lived. With this awareness, you reclaimed your value in a profound way. You no longer accepted emotional breadcrumbs. You no longer lowered your standards to keep someone comfortable. You no longer diluted your authenticity to fit into their emotional limitations. You began to stand rooted in the truth of who you are, a person who brings depth, presence, and integrity to relationships. And you reclaim your value. The narrative of your life transforms. Instead of viewing the situation as a loss, you began seeing it as a lesson. Instead of seeing yourself as someone who was abandoned, you saw that you were protected. Instead of seeing their withdrawal as rejection, you understood it as redirection towards something more aligned, more reciprocal, more emotionally available. Awareness turned pain into wisdom. It turned confusion into discernment. It turned longing into self-respect. It turned attachment into clarity. Rewriting your narrative didn't require a dramatic declaration. It happened through subtle but powerful shifts. Choosing yourself, honoring your boundaries, trusting your intuition, and refusing to compromise your emotional well-being for the sake of someone else's comfort zone. You rewrote the story by realizing you were never too much. You were simply the wrong match for someone who wasn't ready to receive the kind of depth you carry. With this newfound awareness, you stepped into a truth that cannot be reversed. Your value is inherent, not negotiable. And once you know that, every part of your life begins to shift to reflect it. The moment they realized you weren't naive was the moment they understood your power, because it shattered the story they had silently written about you. People who operate from avoidance often tell themselves comforting narratives to justify their behavior. They might believe you're attached because you don't see their patterns. They might assume you tolerate inconsistency because you're unaware. They might interpret your patience as unawareness, your empathy as weakness, your quiet understanding as emotional dependence. But then, something shifts. Without you ever raising your voice, demanding validation, or proving a point, the truth becomes undeniable. You weren't fooled. You were simply watching. You weren't lost. You were learning. You weren't naive. You were discerning. And that realization disrupts everything they believed. When someone who avoids intimacy suddenly sees that you understood the dynamic the entire time, it exposes the fragility of their emotional strategies. Avoidance only works when the other person is kept in the dark, confused, or emotionally reactive. But when they realize you were calm, centered, and aware of what was happening, the illusion collapses. They can no longer hide behind the idea that they were protecting themselves from someone who wouldn't understand. They realize you understood too well. They can no longer tell themselves that pulling away didn't matter because you wouldn't notice. You noticed everything. And they can no longer convince themselves that their behavior kept them safe from deeper connection. They see that you saw the depth they were scared to face. This realization is powerful because it confronts their deepest fear, the fear of being truly seen. And not just seen, but seen with compassion, clarity, and emotional intelligence. It exposes all the emotions they never expressed, all the inconsistencies they never acknowledged, all the patterns they believed they concealed. Avoidants don't expect to be understood, they expect to be misread. When they encounter someone who sees them without judgment, it creates an internal conflict. Part of them is drawn toward the safety of that understanding, and part of them runs from it, because understanding leads to vulnerability, and vulnerability feels terrifying. But in witnessing your awareness, they also witness your strength. They realize that while they were retreating, you were growing. While they were hiding feelings, you were processing yours. While they were avoiding the truth, you were embracing it. You didn't collapse under their distance. You outgrew it. You didn't chase their lack of clarity. You found your own. You didn't wait for their validation. You validated yourself. And this is where your power becomes unmistakable. Your power was never in confrontation. It was in evolution, in emotional resilience, in the way you continued to rise despite their inconsistency, in the way you maintained your integrity even when they withdrew. Your strength was revealed not through aggression, but through inner transformation. And once they saw that transformation, it forced a reevaluation of everything they assumed about you. They began to realize that you were not someone who could be controlled through silence. You were not someone who would be destabilized by mixed signals. You were not someone who mistook avoidance for affection. You were someone who could see truth, feel deeply, and still choose alignment over attachment. Your awareness, your grow, your unwavering authenticity, these became undeniable evidence of your emotional power. And once someone sees your power, they can never unsee it, even if they don't say it, even if they remain distant, even if they never express the magnitude of their realization. Something within them shifts. They understand that they misjudged you. They understand that you were never operating from confusion. You were operating from clarity. They understand that you didn't lose yourself in the dynamic. You found yourself through it. And perhaps the most powerful part of all is this. The moment they realized you weren't naive was the moment you realized you no longer needed their recognition. Your power didn't come from their acknowledgement. It came from your awareness, your self-respect, your healing, and your willingness to walk forward with your heart still open. Not naive, not blind, but consciously, courageously aware. Thank you for sharing this journey with such openness and depth. Goodbye for now. May clarity, strength, and purpose continue to guide your path.